In Italy, they were defined from August 1940 as mobilized civilians to give a more formal military status to the home front and to prevent civil defenders from absconding. When Herbert Morrison, the British Minister for Home Security, reflected at the end of the war on the millions who had served in civil defense roles, he described them as a citizen army made up of rank and file warriors, men and women alike. Civil defense measures were eventually introduced across the globe, even in areas remote from the real prospect of bombing. No aggregate figure of the numbers involved can easily be calculated, chiefly because a distinction needs to be made between those civilians who undertook full time or part time civil defense tasks as air raid wardens, auxiliary firemen, shelter guardians, first aid trainees, and welfare personnel, and those millions of householders and young people who were co-opted to undertake air raid training and air raid duties, but who were not formally uniformed civil defenders. This second category embraced a vast urban and in some cases rural constituency that numbered tens of millions. Residents were expected to play a part as civilians in what the German authorities called self protection of homes and workplaces under the supervision of the formal civil defense organizations. Civil defenders and their numerous auxiliaries were usually tasked with protecting their own community and were rarely transferred away from the region or town in which they lived, a factor that played an important part in explaining their commitment through difficult years to saving a place that was familiar. Civil defense was socially inclusive and made no distinction of gender, giving women an important part to play in community defense, in contrast to their more restricted role in the regular military apparatus. Women volunteered in large numbers for the many civil defense services as local communities were denuded of younger men. In Germany, around 200,000 of the full time officials in the civil defense organization were women. In Britain, by 1940, there were 151,000 full time and part time women civil defense workers, including the auxiliary fire service, and a further 158,000 supporting the first aid services. In the United States, almost two-thirds of Washington's home defense volunteers were women. In Detroit, around half. Schoolboys and girls were also recruited for particular tasks. Boy Scout volunteers in Britain bravely cycled between air raid posts with emergency messages. The Soviet Union recruited from Komsomol, the Soviet youth movement, for youngsters to join rescue teams or to spot incendiaries on rooftops. In the final months of the bombing over Germany, Hitler Youth members were posted as Flakhelfer, anti aircraft auxiliaries, to man the anti aircraft guns in the absence of regular Air Force troops. The largest civil defense organizations were founded in Japan, Germany, and the Soviet Union, where the defense of local communities from the effects of bombing became an almost universal obligation. Japanese preparations dated back to the late 1920s, with blackout practices and air raid drills in major cities involving the entire urban population. In April 1937, a national aid defense law introduced a nationwide program through which local urban bloc associations and smaller neighborhood groups in towns and villages became responsible for ensuring that all civilians were transformed into potential civil defenders. 2 years later, the government established auxiliary fire and police forces recruited from civilian communities to help cope with raiding. Civil defense was based on traditions of collective commitment that left little room for dissent. The large civil defense organizations established in the Soviet Union and in Germany were similarly authoritarian and collectivist, reflecting the ambition in both dictatorships to mobilize their citizens for a wide range of activities designed to cement their public commitment to the purposes of the national community. The Soviet Society for Assistance to Defense, or Sovyakim, dating from 1927, had at least 15 million members by 1933, including 3 million women, when the threat from bombing was minimal. They were given rudimentary training in air raid defense, on how to cope with a gas attack, and on post bombing first aid. In July 1941, a decree on universal and compulsory anti air raid preparations turned every citizen into an impromptu civil defender. By 1944, it was claimed that a remarkable 71 million Soviet citizens of all ages had received some form of civil defense training. In cities closer to the threat of bombing, the authorities set up urban self defense units to assist in firefighting and rescue, and by the end of the war, these units had 2.9 million members. Those recruited were expected to play a full part in preparing their communities for bomb attacks and in combating the after effects of a raid. Alongside this army of civilian civil defenders, the state established in 1932 the main Directorate of Local Air Defense, MPVO, which had formal responsibility for training civil defense personnel, creating a network of shelters, principally in residential buildings, and supplying fire and rescue services following a raid. The MPVO workers were paramilitary civil defenders, and at the wartime peak, they numbered a further 747,000. The German Reich Air Defense League, Reichsluftschutzbund, set up in 1933 by the newly founded Air Ministry, was rapidly expanded as the principal agent for educating and training the public about air raid precautions. In May 1937, a law on self protection, Selbstschutz, was introduced, compelling all householders to prepare their homes and buildings against an air attack, to assist with air raid protection for public buildings and offices, or to take part in work protection for factories. Because the regime insisted that community self defense was an obligation as it was in the Soviet Union and Japan, there were 11 million members of the League by 1937, 13 million by 1939, and 22 million by 1943, one quarter of the German population. The organization itself had 1.5 million office holders by 1942 and ran a system of 3,400 air raid schools where basic training was undertaken. There was also a formal structure of air raid protection supplied by Air Protection Police and Fire Protection Police and by the regional German Air Force commands, but their work depended a great deal on the voluntary contribution made by League members in organizing and inspecting the air raid preparations of local communities to ensure that self protection was being fully observed and in supplying the men and women needed for civilian civil defense roles.